Nice of you guys to have me. I know, you could be home drinking a Bud Light and watching Tucker Carlson tonight, and instead you're here with me, so I appreciate that. I speak to Republican groups all over the United States on a wide variety of issues, more or less related to economics. I try to help people understand the logic of how things work. So for example, I try to help people understand that if you were to shut down the entire economy over a stupid virus and then print $6 trillion out of thin air and hand it out to people in exchange for not working, you get inflation. I'm not sure how shocked you were, but that should not have been shocking. I help people understand that if you hire people based on race and gender and not competence, then not only is that grossly unfair, but if you keep doing it, sooner or later you are going to end up inevitably with Kamala Harris. So,
or Elizabeth City.
I'm going to talk with you guys tonight about one of those bad ideas that is damaging our country and in fact the whole Western world for quite some time, and it begins with a 19th century Englishman named Thomas Malthus, who was the granddaddy of overpopulation theory. Malthus explained that the human population grows exponentially and the food supply only grows arithmetically, and so if you play that out, we're gonna run out of food and we're all gonna starve to death and die. And Malthus, who was a mathematician by training, actually went to the trouble of calculating this out. He calculated the entire world's food supply would be completely exhausted by 1889. It's the last year there's going to be even a morsel of food left in the entire world. So, when 1889 came and went and there was still plenty of food, you might say, well, that's the end of Malthus. He's got this idea and it's wrong. Must be time for him to shuffle off to the dustbin of history, but that's not what happened. Malthus is being taught to your kids and grandkids in colleges and universities all over the United States today as a genius who warned us about the dangers of overpopulation ahead of his time. And he said other interesting things too. He said, for instance, that we should not feed the poor. He said what we ought to do instead is use that money to build swamps near where the poor people live, because the swamps would spread malaria and the poor people would get malaria and die, and that would help improve our overpopulation problem. And you're probably thinking, saying stuff like that must get him into some trouble in the modern American university. You're wrong again. You just don't understand modern American universities. So far from being discredited, Malthus gives rise to a whole new generation of overpopulation theorists in the 20th century, the most famous of whom is named Paul Ehrlich. He wrote a book in 1969 called The Population Bomb, and it was a huge international bestseller. 100 million copies, 27 languages. And Ehrlich says this is it. He says the human race has reached its peak. It's all downhill from here. He predicts that hundreds of millions of people were going to start starving to death any minute. He predicts that 40 million Americans will starve to death, he writes, before the 1970s are over. Who wants to guess how many Americans starved to death in the 1970s? Do I hear a zero? That would be the correct answer, would be zero. He was off by 40 million. And don't get me wrong, anybody can make a mistake. But what's fascinating is what actually did happen while these predictions were busy not coming true. You know what actually happened in the world? From 1950 to today, the world's population has more than doubled. We use about a third less farmland than we used in 1950, which is very important because Malthus said we would run out of farmland. Instead, as our population gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the amount of farmland we use to feed them gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and there is far less hunger and far more prosperity in the world today than anyone ever thought was even possible in 1950. The question is, how and why? Why were Ehrlich and Malthus so wrong? You understand, they weren't slightly off. They were two of the wrongest people in the history of the world. What did they miss? And the first part of understanding that is you need to understand that we're talking about human beings. See, had they been writing about any other species, other than human beings, they might very well have been right. If there's too many deer in the forest, you know what happens? They starve. They do starve. But as the human population increases, we not only don't starve, we get richer instead. Why is that? It's like there's a genuine force of nature here that runs one way for human beings and the exact opposite way for every single other species of animal, plant, whatever under the sun. And the answer is, there's actually two answers, because there's two tricks that the human race has that are entirely unique. By which I mean there is no other example of either of these in the entire universe that we know of. And these are human things, and they're only human things. And the first trick, is that we humans innovate. Nothing else innovates. There is no innovation in the universe other than human innovation. Well, what does innovation mean? How does it work? Well, it begins when an individual human being has an idea. And I want to make sure we understand what an idea is. An idea is when you picture in your head something which you've never seen, because you can't have seen it because it doesn't exist, except in your head. No animal can do that, by the way. No animal can imagine what's never seen. Human beings do it all the time. And then we test out our ideas in a process called experimentation. And I'll tell you the truth, 99% of the experiments fail, and it doesn't matter. Nobody cares about the failed experiments. Failed experiments blow away like the dust in the wind. Doesn't matter at all. What matters is that 1% of the experiments succeed, and when they succeed, the entire human race takes a step forward. If anybody anywhere on planet Earth figures out a better way to do anything, you're benefiting from it within 6 months. Did you know that? Every 2 years, I go back to the Verizon store to get another phone and sign another 2-year contract. And this has been going on for quite some time. I've noticed a pattern. Every 2 years I walk into the Verizon store, and the first thing they do is they laugh at my old phone. They say, oh my gosh, you're still using that old clunker that we sold you 2 years ago? Well, our phones today are so much better than anything we ever dreamt of back then. It's not even funny. Now, I don't really know exactly what the phone people have invented in the last 2 years. I certainly couldn't tell you the names of the inventors, and I suspect I'll never use most of it. But you know what I also know? Every trick the phone people have come up with, not only in the last 2 years, but every trick the phone people have come up with from the very beginning, including the last 2 years, I have it all. My new phone has every trick the phone people have ever figured out, and if I ever need to use it, I will just ask my kids to explain it to me, and then I'll be able to use it, okay? So if you understand this, you understand that the more humans there are in the world, the more ideas there are in the world. The more ideas, the more experiments. The more experiments, the more successful experiments, and the human race advances faster, farther on a bigger population than a smaller population. And this is the first reason that there is no such thing, which is what I've come here today to tell you. There's no such thing as overpopulation for human beings. With one caveat, this only works if people are free. Non-free people don't get to experiment because they're not free. So for example, there's like 20 million people who live in North Korea, and they actually are starving. Not because of their population, but because they're not free. They can't do the things necessary to improve their lives. Okay, so the corrected version is, as long as people are free, there's no such thing as overpopulation. But I've only told you the first trick. There's a second trick, which is completely unique, and there's no other example of this in the entire universe, no other species of anything like this. And this one deals not with how we come up with new stuff, but how we handle the information, the knowledge that we've already accumulated in the past. See, when I said that humans were completely different than every other species under the sun, I bet you thought it's because our brains are so big. But are they? Are they? We were talking about the deer in the forest. Is your brain bigger than the deer's brain? I won't hold you in suspense. Yes, your brain is bigger than a deer's brain, but how much bigger? Is it 1,000,000 times bigger? 100 times bigger? 10 times? 5? 3? 2? It's about 50% bigger. Which I think raises a fascinating question. If your brain is only 50% bigger than a deer's brain, How come your life is 1,000,000 times better than the deer's life? Because it is, you know. Look at your life, look at the deer. You could hop on an airplane and be on the other side of the planet in a few hours, and it wouldn't even be very hard to arrange that, would it? You could pick up your smartphone and Google up anything that's happened in the history of the universe. You've got art, music, poetry, science, technology, philosophy, architecture, cuisine, fashion, on and on it goes. The deer is wandering naked through the forest looking for berries to eat. Period. That's his entire life. Every single day of the deer's life is exactly the same as every other day of the deer's life. He gets up, he looks for berries, he goes to bed. Every deer has the exact same life as every other deer. Your life is 1,000,000 times what that deer's life is. The question is, how did you manage to swing that on a brain that's only 50% bigger? That's an economic kind of question. And the answer is that we humans have come up with something totally unique. And that is that we spread our knowledge out over the entire human population in such a way that every one of us gets to benefit every minute of every day from vast amounts of knowledge which we do not actually have. Knowledge which we can't have because our brains aren't big enough. To illustrate this point, I will ask you to think for a moment, if you would, about every single solitary thing that you own. Let your mind wander through your house for a moment. Your furniture, your dishes, your TV set, your toothbrush. Think about every possession you have under the sun, and I have one question for you. How much of that stuff do you know how to make yourself? Like none of it? Am I close? How did you get all this stuff that you don't have the foggiest idea how to make? And the answer is you don't have to know how to make it because somebody else knows how to make it. Nor could you. How could you possibly have all the skills necessary to make all the stuff that's sitting in your house right now? Nobody could have that many different skills. Your brain's not big enough. But you don't have that problem because somebody else has it. Okay? Again, no other species does this. We spread our knowledge out and we all benefit from it. So for example, I own a car, which I use all the time. I drove here today in my car. I use it very useful for me. Do I know how to make a car? If I were all by myself on a desert island like Robinson Crusoe, how long do you think it would take me to make a car from scratch? Even if we would presume that the rubber and the iron and the petroleum is all on my island. And the answer is never. I could live to be 1,000,000 years old. I will not have made a car from scratch. Truth is, nobody in the entire world, nobody knows how to make a car. There's 1,000,000 people who each know a tiny little piece of how to make a car. And they get together and make a car. I don't know any of the pieces, and I don't have to, because when I need a car, you know what I do? I go to the people who know how to make cars, and you know what? They already made it. Apparently they knew I was coming, because they've already made it. It's sitting in the lot waiting for me. All I have to do is pay for it. Through the miracle of capitalism, I get to focus on one small area where I'm reasonably competent and trade the proceeds for the highly specialized skills of 1,000,000 people I've never even met. People who made my car don't even speak the same language I speak. Is that a problem? Not at all. I don't have to speak to them. They know how to make a car, I want a car. It's a universal language, speaking not necessary. Okay? So if you understand this, I would say to you, what is the repository for all human knowledge that we've accumulated through the millennia on this planet? How do you make a car? How do you make a cell phone? How do you make a skyscraper? How do you perform open heart surgery? Where do we keep all this information? If somebody in your family needed heart surgery, what would you do? Learn heart surgery? See if there's a YouTube video on how to do heart surgery? You're going to go to a guy who has spent his entire life focused just on heart surgery. That's what he does. He knows all about it. And you get the benefit of his highly specialized skill for a couple hours. Then he goes his way, you go your way. We do this all the time without even thinking about it. So the repository of all human knowledge, the hard drive of the human race, is 8 billion individual human brains all over the world. Every trick the human race has learned is somewhere in those 8 billion brains, and what our economy is a processing machine that maintains all of this knowledge and gets it to the right places. We tap into these networks of knowledge all the time without even thinking about it. And that is the second reason there is no such thing as overpopulation for human beings. The bigger the human population, the bigger our hard drive, the more knowledge from which everyone gets to benefit. Okay? And you could say, well, it's interesting. Is this important? Do I need to know this? And there's a couple answers. One is, it's important to understand that capitalism, properly understood, is pro-life. Capitalism is about understanding that the greatest gift that God gives us is each other. While every other species under the sun is competing amongst themselves for scarce resources, we humans uniquely make each other richer. It's a beautiful, uniquely human thing we ought to celebrate more than we do. Another reason this is important is that there is a movement abroad in our land today which is very evil and very dangerous because they're anti-human and anti-prosperity. They think that human beings are bad and they think that prosperity is worse. And they're teaching it to your kids and your grandkids today all over the United States and the Western world. And I refer to the environmentalist movement. And I think for too long, we Republicans looked at environmentalists as kind of harmless do-gooders, you know. They may be a little quirky, but their heart's in the right place. You know what Bill O'Reilly always used to say? I mean, apparently he used to say a bunch of things that I was not necessarily aware, you know, at the time that he was saying them. But I always used to watch his show at 8 o'clock, and that was Tucker Carlson. I always used to watch Bill O'Reilly at 8 o'clock on Fox News, and whenever he had an environmentalist wacko on, he would say, there's nothing wrong with wanting a cleaner planet. That was his go-to line. I heard him say it dozens of times over the years, and I disagree. I think there's something deeply, profoundly wrong with wanting a cleaner planet. Do you know what that is? It doesn't make a lick of sense. That's what's wrong with it. You know what our planet is made of? It's made of dirt. We live on a ball of dirt floating through the galaxy. Is that not so? Would someone like to tell me what the difference is between a clean ball of dirt and a dirty ball of dirt? This isn't science. This is bad poetry disguised as science, and I, for one, am getting a little tired of being lectured on science by a bunch of people who don't think there's a difference between boys and girls, okay? I'm just saying. And our ball of dirt is about 8,000 miles from here to here. Do you know how deep in we can drill with the latest state-of-the-art 21st century technology? 10 miles? It's not even 1%. We barely scratch a fraction of 1% of the Earth's crust. We find stuff, we bring it to other parts of a fraction of 1% of the Earth's crust. We put it through chemical processes that happen in nature all the time anyhow, and we're wrecking the planet? You kidding me? You couldn't wreck the planet if you tried. You couldn't wreck the planet if you devoted your life to wrecking the planet. Nothing you do in your life will harm the planet in any way, shape, or form. Nothing you do in your life will help the planet in any way, shape, or form. The planet is going to outlive us all. I absolutely guarantee it. And it's about time that we started explaining this to our kids and our grandkids, because they're getting a very different message from the media and from the educational system and from the entertainment industry, and it is 100% nonsense. And I'll tell you something else. We're never going to run out of anything either, which is very important, because since I was like this tall, I've been hearing my entire life that we were about to run out of stuff. Have you not been hearing this your whole life that we're running out of stuff? Have we? Have we run out of anything? Don't you think by now we would have run out of something? Just so they could hang their head up and say, see, we ran out of something? Nothing. I remember when my daughter came home from school one day, and this was years ago. My daughter's an old lady now, but years ago she came home from school and told me we were running out of water. And I said, no, we're not. And if my memory is correct, this was the last year that any of my kids went to a public school. I'm just saying. And I said, no, we're not. Not only are we not running out of water, we have the same amount of water to the drop that we had 1,000 years ago. Or 2,000. Or, doesn't matter, pick your year. From the beginning of the world till today, and every day in between, we've had the exact same amount of water every single solitary day. And the next day, after this conversation with my daughter, I went to work and I told this anecdote to a liberal Democrat friend of mine at work. And he said, well, maybe technically we have the same amount of water, but we have less usable water. And I said, oh really? same amount of water, less, if I'm following you correctly, I guess we must have more unusable water, right? Tell me something. Where do they keep the unusable water? Where is all the unusable water? Last time I checked, 99% of all the water in the world is in the ocean. Is that not still? I haven't looked recently, but I'm pretty sure it's in the ocean. The usable and the unusable is all mixed together in the ocean. Is that not so? You know what happens? It evaporates out of the ocean into the cloud. I guess that's the usable part. Into the clouds, and then the clouds come over the land, and it comes down in the form of rain. Perhaps you've heard about this before. And they catch a tiny fraction of the rain in a reservoir, right? And they pipe it to my house. So I'm hosing down my driveway, and my liberal neighbor says, "You're wasting water." I say, "No, I'm not. It was going to land on the ground over here. They just caught it in a reservoir and piped it to me, and now I'm spraying it on the ground over here. And moreover, it's going to seep into the ground, it's going to work its way back to the ocean, and the same thing is going to happen as has been happening since as long as the earth has been here. You cannot waste water. Cannot, I dare you. Go home, get a glass of water, your kitchen sink, see if you can make it go away, so that your great-great-grandkids will not have access to that water. It is impossible to waste water. Now, it is possible that you could live in a particular area at a particular point in time where you are having a local drought. Not because we're running out of water, we're never going to run out of water, but your particular town did not get as much rainfall as you wanted, and it may make sense to conserve water if you're living in a drought because of the drought. But you know what the long-term solution is? Build more reservoirs. You can pipe water from anywhere to anywhere. You can pipe water thousands of miles. The Romans were doing this 2,000 years ago. It's not even a new idea. And you can solve the problem forever. When I was in California, I tour around the country. I was touring in California a few years back, and they were having one of their periodic droughts in California. And the governor of California was this guy named Jerry Brown. Do you remember him? Yeah. He was the governor at the time. And I learned that his father had also been the governor of California. That Pat Brown, the father, was the governor of California in the 60s, and Jerry Brown, the son, was the governor when I was there during the drought, and they were both liberal Democrats. But there's a fascinating difference between the two of them. Pat Brown, the father, was a great reservoir builder. He built new reservoirs all over California because the population was booming. Hard to imagine now, but back then everybody wanted to move to California. That was the place he wanted to go, and he knew that he would need lots of water, so he saw his job as governor to make sure there's plenty of water for all the people who wanted to move to California. His son was governor through 5 years of drought, vetoed every proposal to expand reservoir capacity during the drought. Well, what changed between the father and the son? And the answer is obvious enough, and that is that the Democratic Party has been taken over by environmentalist wackos who are anti-human and anti-prosperity. They don't want to solve people's problems. They want people to suffer because they think that people are bad and prosperity is worse. And this is very good news for us because we Republicans are the pro-human, pro-prosperity party. They are the anti-human, anti-prosperity party. And last time I checked, every single voter is a human. Maybe not in California, but in most states, every voter is a human, okay? Being the pro-human party, it's not like we're taking a huge risk by siding with the humans. I'm just saying. And I want to take this in one more direction because it's so relevant to the conversations we're having politically in our country today. I said we've got the same amount of water from the beginning of the world till today and every day in between. What else do we have the same amount of from the beginning of the world till today and every day in between?
Air.
Okay, well, that's close. I think there's probably an even better answer, though, and it is everything. Everything. Because the Earth is made out of a bunch of Legos that we call atoms. Is that not so? You, me, the table, the chairs, the floor, the ground, and the floor. It's a bunch of atoms. And the atoms come in a bunch of different varieties. Remember the periodic table from high school? Okay, there's, oxygen and nitrogen and helium and iron and I think there's like 100 and something on the periodic table. All physical things in the universe are made out of those elements, those atoms. but it's kind of an exaggeration, the list. Because down at the bottom of the list, you find, at the bottom of the periodic table, you find things like californium and newtonium and einsteinium. I'm not making this up, they were like naming these after their friends after a while. Okay, that stuff doesn't really exist. You've never seen einsteinium in your entire life and you're not going to. Truth is that it's really a much shorter, in reality, it's a much shorter list than the periodic table. 99% of the Earth and everything that's on it, 99% of our entire world is made up of just 8 elements. Did you know that? That's 99% of the world right there. And the remaining 1% is a couple dozen more. The Earth is a pot of stew with 8 major ingredients. There's some potatoes and carrots and beef and things like that. Okay? And a couple dozen minor ingredients. There's some salt and pepper and spices, paprika, oregano, okay? And it's all there. I don't know, do you put oregano in stew? Maybe not. And that's it, and it's a closed system. Nothing new comes in, nothing that's there goes out. It's the exact same ingredients, they just mix around in the stew. Given that reality, and I don't know, anyone who's going to be able to doubt that that is our reality, that the Earth is a closed pot of stew with 8 major ingredients and a couple dozen minor ingredients, what does the word pollution even mean? Just something to think about. I'm not going to answer that. Just something to take home and ponder. Is what does pollution mean, given that we live in a closed system that's had the exact same ingredients for all time? Just a thought. But the one I want to draw your attention to is carbon. Because after Bill O'Reilly left Fox News, and before Tucker Carlson left Fox News, Tucker Carlson had on an environmentalist wacko. This was a couple years back. He had on this guy who was an environmentalist wacko, and the guy said, carbon is bad, and we gotta stop producing it. And I'm home watching this, and I was thinking, carbon is bad? It's an element from the periodic table. Are there good elements and bad elements? Can elements have moral failings? This never came up in my high school chemistry class. And I'm actually going to go farther than that, because I am not a scientist, I'm actually an economist. And as an economist, I feel comfortable breaking some of the rules of science. So I am actually going to declare carbon to be a good element. You know why? We're made out of it. All life on Earth is made out of carbon. If that doesn't make you a good element, I don't know what does. So I unscientifically declare carbon to be a good element, and I'll tell you something else. We don't produce it. You've never produced carbon in your entire life. You can't produce carbon. We've got the exact same number of carbon elements in the world from the beginning of the world to the day and every day in between. What it does is it cycles through the environment like everything else does all the time. Sometimes carbon bonds with oxygen and forms a gas called carbon dioxide, which we're all exhaling right now. It's floating around the room right now. Okay? Sometimes carbon bonds with heavier elements and ends up in the ground, like diamonds are made of carbon, coal is made of carbon. Okay? So it moves around. So if there was too much carbon in the atmosphere, and I'm not saying there is, but if there were to be too much carbon in the atmosphere, what do you think takes it out of the atmosphere? Any guesses? What takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? Trees. Trees and green plants and trees. They absorb the carbon dioxide, they split it in half, they release the oxygen for us to breathe, and the carbon remains part of the plant. When the tree keels over and dies, that's the carbon returning to the earth. So, should we plant more trees? Well, if you like trees, plant trees, that's fine, but you don't have to, because it's happening automatically. The fact that human beings release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere through our human industry, do you know what a side effect of it is? It stimulates the trees. It stimulates the trees. The trees love the fact that human industry produces carbon dioxide. Tell this to your environmentalist wacko friends. They are thrilled that we're producing carbon dioxide because that's what they breathe. And they're going faster and faster, and they love it, and they're absorbing this. The Earth has been getting greener and greener and greener. We've had satellites in orbit since the 1950s. You know what those satellites show? Every single year, the Earth has been getting greener. A year from the 50s to today, what is that, 70 years? The Earth is getting greener and greener and greener and greener and greener. You know why? All that carbon dioxide we're producing. We're not producing because the carbon was already there, but we're releasing carbon into the atmosphere. The trees love it. They're thrilled. And they're taking it out of the atmosphere. They're releasing the oxygen for us to breathe. It is the natural cycle of events. Nothing's wrong. Nothing needs to be fixed. There is no crisis whatsoever. It's merely the same ingredients floating through the cycle as they have always done. Now, I've given this talk a couple different times in a couple different places, and a couple interesting questions have arisen. If you ask a good enough question, you end up getting folded into the talk. So, I was in Minnesota, which I will be again. I'm going back to Minnesota next month. I was in Minnesota years ago, and there was a Republican ladies group, and one of the ladies raised her hand and said, she said, don't China and India have a problem with overpopulation? And I said, no ma'am, neither China nor India has ever had a problem with overpopulation. What they both had for a long time was a socialism problem. Socialism was making their people very poor. And population had nothing to do with it. And you don't have to take my word for it, I can prove it to you without even leaving the room, because for the last 20 years, both China and India have been moving away from socialism toward capitalism. The United States has been busy going the other way. But they, in China and India, have been abandoning socialism for capitalism, and now their economies are booming. China and India have the two fastest growing economies in the entire world, and have had for like 20 years straight now. I wish our economy were growing like that. It's not, because we're going the other way. But they're booming, and their population never went down. Their populations continue to go up. You can't tell me they had an overpopulation problem back then if they don't have a problem now with a bigger population. What they did was they got rid of the socialism, and their problems went away. But I still thought it was a good question. So the other one, this was in Florida, and it was, it was one of those things, like, it wasn't funny at the moment. Sometimes things are funny the next morning, and when they happen, they weren't funny. Does that make sense? Yeah. I finished my talk in Florida, and this guy in the back of the room pops up like a jack-in-the-box and starts making a beeline for me. I'm watching him like coming in like a missile toward my podium and picking up speed as he's going. And I started backing away from the podium, and he's zooming in, and I remember he threw his hands down on the podium, and he said, listen, he said, the earth is finite. The human propensity to reproduce is infinite. There has got to be a point where we simply run out of room. And I said, no, not true. And I'll tell you what I told, actually I'm going to ask you what I asked him. I said, have you ever been to Arizona? So, who's been to Arizona? I spent 10 years there one summer. Arizona is a kind of a fascinating place because it's the only place I've been where they don't have weather. It's like nobody listens to a weather report in Arizona because there isn't weather. It's never rainy, it's never snowy, it's never foggy, it's never windy, it's never chilly. In the summer in Arizona, it's 115 degrees every single solitary day without fail for 6 months straight. And at night, it cools down to 102. And if you will reflect on that for a moment, you will understand why, from the beginning of the world until just a couple of years ago, Arizona was one of the least populated pieces of land in the entire world. Because who could live like that? I want you to imagine living in that kind of heat 24 hours a day for 6 months straight before air conditioning was invented. Hadn't even been invented yet. You gotta be one tough cookie to live like that. And virtually nobody did. And then just a few years ago, somebody invented air conditioning, and Shazam, it's a whole new ballgame. Do you know what's been the fastest growing state in the United States over the course of the last 50 years? 1970 to 2020, Arizona. You know why? Air conditioning. It changed everything. When I spoke to the group in Arizona, I told them the state flag of Arizona should have a picture of an air conditioner on it, because that's what's changed their state. That's like the whole secret to the state of Arizona. Do you understand what we did, what we humans did? We made the world bigger. We made the world bigger. It's not just Arizona, is it? Southern Texas, southern Florida, there's whole continents down there. Okay? We took vast amounts of territory that were previously uninhabitable and made them habitable. How? Through human innovation. There is way more territory that humans can live now than we could back then because of our innovation. When I went back to Florida, I made the same point about Florida. And Florida used to be a tiny state. Go back and look at 19th century presidential elections. Florida had like 3 electoral votes. Nobody cared about Florida. Okay, now it's rapidly becoming the biggest state in the country. Why? Air conditioning. I made that point in Florida, and a lady there raised her hand and said, mosquito control too. And that's right, but it's the exact same point. We humans solve the problem. We make it work. We're making the earth bigger for ourselves all the time. Will our descendants at some point be living on other planets? Like Mars or the moon or whatever? You betcha. Don't think it'll happen in my lifetime, but it will happen. And the technology that will make it possible will be a direct result of a larger human population, which will allow for faster technological innovation and a bigger pool of knowledge from which everyone can benefit. It's a bright, positive future if we can avoid the twin enemies of mankind, which are socialism and environmentalism. And there's my economic thought for the day. Let me take a minute and tell you about the books that you had so kindly asked about. Years ago, my friends said you should write a book. And I did, and it was like the wrong book. Everyone thought I was going to write a 500-page tome about economics. But I had an epiphany that people don't read 500-page tomes about economics. You write something fun and funny and accessible, you reach millions more people. So my first book was called The New Democrat. It's a parody history of the Obama years done as The Cat in the Hat. Has everyone read The Cat in the Hat? If you have kids, you must have read The Cat in the Hat. Okay, so the cat shows up uninvited at this middle-class American home. What's he do when he gets inside? He wrecks the place. Now it seems kind of like Obama. And remember his 2 friends, Thing 1 and Thing 2, who wrecked the place he worked? Well, they became Reed and Pelosi. And I realized I was writing the complete history of the Obama years, all done just like The Cat in the Hat. I got my first book review, Salon.com, said that this was the most twisted piece of conservative propaganda print matter out there. And I was touched. That's on the cover now. And I was moved to write my second book. Who's read The Lorax by Dr. Seuss? Dr. Seuss, by the way, was a huge leftist, a lifelong member of the American Socialist Party, of course he was, and he fills his children's books with socialist lessons for your kids, and The Lorax was his environmentalist book. It's about an evil capitalist called the Onceler, who cuts down trees and makes consumer goods. And we are taught that that is bad, bad, bad. He drives the trees to extinction. He wipes them out till they're extinct, there's no more trees, and his factory promptly goes out of business because there's no more trees. And I read this to my kids, and I said, does that make sense to you? Do you think that capitalists destroy species that their business depends on? Do you think that Colonel Sanders is going to drive the chicken to extinction? Is anybody here worried about that? Is Colonel Sanders going to throw every last chicken into the fryer and then they'll be extinct and we'll never see another chicken again? I think it's exactly the opposite. I think Colonel Sanders cares more about the survival of the chicken species than anybody on the planet, including the chickens. He's got billions wrapped up in this. There are going to be more chickens as long as Colonel Sanders has anything to say about it. And I'll tell you something else. There are more chickens alive in the world today than ever before in history. Do you know why? Because we like to eat them. That's why. The greatest thing that ever happens to a species is that human beings like to eat you. This is like winning the species lottery. Chickens, cows, wheat, corn, potatoes, tomato, pick your species. We clear millions of acres just for you. We keep the predators away, we feed you, you get sick, we bring in doctors for you. What other species gets that? So this was a book that very much needed to be parodied. Mine is called The Gorax, because it stars Al Gore as the Lorax character. It's about how America used to be free and prosperous, and we were prosperous because we were free, and then the environmentalist wackos showed up, and step by step, regulation by regulation, started driving everybody out of business. The Wizard of Iz is obviously a parody of The Wizard of Oz. My first thought was that Bill Clinton made a really great wizard, because as you will recall, the original wizard is a fake. He's a Charlotte, it's all smoke and mirrors. I thought Clinton fit perfectly. When they first meet him in my book, they say, "Are you the Wizard of Iz?" He says, "It all depends on your definition of Iz." Hillary is the Wicked Witch. Remember the Cowardly Lion? I replaced him with a Cowardly Rhino who suspects the Democrats are wrong, but he's too scared to do anything about it. He's looking for the courage to do something useful when he gets to Washington. And it's a nice story. It starts when Dorothy's house lands on Obama, and she finds herself in the land of the free lunchkins who have been living off the government for so long they've forgotten how to take care of themselves. To think that I saw it on CNN Live, narrated by Jim Acosta, is about the media and Trump. It is, on the one hand, the Trump story, but it's about the pathological dishonesty of our media. Motley Clique is a parody, kind of, sort of Moby Dick. Like, I need to have like some background story I'm playing off of. So it's Moby Dick, but what it's about is the whole critical race theory, identity politics world that we live in. It's about this 19th century whaling ship full of social justice warriors. And they hire for diversity, so they very carefully have put together a crew with one of everybody. There is a black guy, Jewish guy, Muslim, Asian, gay, Mexican woman, transgender, Indian, lesbian. And they're all out hunting for the great white racist. But they end up catching each other, because they keep finding these flaws in each other's wokeness. Turns out none of them are quite so woke as they made out to be. It's a very ironic book about how the anti-racists are pretty much the most racist people you are ever likely to meet. And then my latest, just out, the ink is practically wet, is called Kamalat, with a K. It is the story of the Biden administration, and it's done as the King Arthur legend. Also, Kamalat, you may recall, was a musical play, right? It was a big thing on Broadway in the 60s. Richard Gere and who else was in there?
Richard Harris.
Richard Burton.
Richard Burton, and there was a Harris in there too, wasn't it?
Yes, I think so. It was a long time ago. But anyhow, so Kamalat is the story of the Biden administration, but it's also my first musical, which is to say that the various characters break into song. Kamala Harris has a song. It's also got Dr. Fauci and who sings a song, and Nancy Pelosi and Hunter Biden each have their own songs in this musical about the 2020 election, the Biden administration, and COVID. This is probably my book that deals significantly with Dr. Fauci and COVID. His song is "I am the very model of a scientific scientist." In case you're wondering. Anyhow, they're fun, unique gifts for like conservative people, Republicans, if you happen to know any. I brought some with me over here. If you'd like to get a book or a set or whatever, I would be happy to oblige, and I can do checks and credit cards and all those kinds of things are fine. They're unique. You're not going to find them in stores. The people you give them to will like them. And it helps me do what I do, which is travel around the country sharing these thoughts with nice folks like yourself. So I think hopefully that's a win-win. And what else? Did you want me to take questions, or sit down and be quiet?
If you would like
no
to.
questions.
Any questions folks have?
Do you ever speak to high school students?
Not very often.
Why wouldn't lighting me up?
I have
It would be interesting to see how they would react to you.
I'm happy to speak to anyone who wants to hear. I am very, very much, and there's a few issues that I feel very strongly about, and I'm very much opposed to the entire public educational system.
Well,
So, which is, not invited to, public schools very much.
neither are we.
I think private schools, and particularly religious-based private schools, are absolutely the way to go. I'm very much in favor of that. I'm very much in favor of homeschooling. I'm in favor of the parents being in charge of what's happening, not educational bureaucrats. I'm in favor of teaching kids the traditional values that have made our country what it is, not having them torn down I think we've got the worst educational system in the world right now, I don't think there's ever been a civilization in history that's had an educational system that was against the civilization. You know, you can't just teach your kids that your civilization is the worst thing ever and expect your civilization to survive. I think it's absolutely a horror. So, yeah, I really did pull my kid, I mean, I have 6 kids. And when the first one was in, I think, the 3rd grade, was, I believe, her last year in public schools. And we completely moved away from that, and I have never regretted it. In fact, it's been getting steadily worse. You know, I have a very good friend of mine is a teacher in South Carolina. And, you know, which I thought would be like a fairly conservative state, okay? It's just hell. There's no discipline. You can't tell the kids anything. If the teacher has a problem with the kid, it's the teacher's problem. The administration will yell at the teacher, and the kid is an innocent little angel who, you know, can't have done anything wrong. I mean, he's like, you know, he's like, you know, being, you know, physically assaulted by his kids, by his students, who have smartphones that he's not allowed to take away from them, and are like filming TikTok videos during class in his classroom. Okay, they're like off in the corner with their smartphones making videos for TikTok in the middle of class, and he can't say anything about it. Because then he's a bad teacher, because he's criticizing his students who are perfect little angels who never did anything wrong. It is a horror that's out there. Yes, ma'am.
There was an interesting chart that came out today. It was from the U.S. Census Bureau, when you were talking about how we have some of the worst education in the world now. It was talking about median household income in the United States by ethnic group. If I call these out, after about 5 or 6, you'll realize where all the educated and rich people are coming from. It's Indian Americans, $100,000 a year is their average income. Filipino Americans, $83,000. Taiwanese Americans, $82,000. Sri Lankan Americans, $74,000. Japanese Americans, $72,000. Malaysian Americans, $70,000. Chinese Americans, $69,000. Pakistani Americans, $66,000. And then you get down to white Americans, $59,000. And you go just more Asian groups where education is pushed in a way that it's not math, science, those types of things.
It's taken very seriously, and it does not attack their own culture.
Right.
They are taught to love their own culture and their own history, and not to hate it.
And the other side of it was the percentage of population with bachelor's degrees, 70%. And when I say Indian, that's not Native American Indian, they're talking about from India.
Sure.
Indian Americans, 70% with a bachelor's degree. Korean Americans, 53%. Chinese Americans, 51%. Filipino Americans, 47%. Japanese Americans, 46%. And the U.S. average was only 28%. So that's how far ahead the Asians, and of course, if they come here, they're going to get free education when they get here, which our children cannot get, free secondary
Possibly
education.
not anymore. They're being attacked.
Well,
Also, it's worth noting that these are countries that don't take immigrants,
right.
which is kind of interesting, and we can, you know, there's all kinds of things to be said about immigration, you know, from many different angles, but it's worth noting, and nobody seems to mind this. There was, when this war broke out in Syria a couple of years ago, and it's a really bad war, and there's all kinds of horrible things that have been happening in Syria, and there was this UN plan to relocate Syrian refugees all over the world. Like, you know, Germany agreed to take like 1 million of them, and the United States took, you know, a couple 100,000 Syrians. The South Korean government initially agreed to, I'm not making this up, agreed to take 40 immigrants. There were riots in South Korea over this. The South Korean population rose up in arms and said nobody's coming here who's not Korean. We are Koreans, that's who belongs in our country. We are not taking any immigrants from anywhere, we don't care what the sob story is. And the government was forced to change its mind and not take the 40 because of the opposition of the Korean population. Just interesting. how these things play out differently in different places. But yes, the Asians, I learned something interesting, this little detail to throw onto the picture you're painting, about Japanese public schools. And one of the things they do in all Japanese schools is 1 week of every year, they don't do any academic stuff at all. And instead, the kids, all of them, get down on their hands and knees and scrub the school clean. Okay, that's what they spend an entire week, okay, with scrub brushes, just scrubbing the floors and the walls and scrubbing the school till it's clean. And the specific reason they do this is not that they can't afford janitors. The reason is to teach the kids humility. It was very interesting. Interesting stuff.
Got one other question here.
Sure.
Do air conditioners seem to draw Democrats because Arizona was a red state not to?
It could be. I mean, this is a story that we see all over. Is that the Republicans come in and make some place prosperous and is doing well, and all the Democrats move in and vote them out, and then it turns into a hellhole. We've seen this pattern happen over and over again. Ronald Reagan's California, he was governor for 8 years, was doing just great, and everybody wanted to move there, and now it's a hellhole. It's very interesting how that cycle works. Anyhow, I hope this was interesting.
Yes, we enjoyed it.
And would love to come back sometime. If you want to check out my books, that's great.
Where do we get the books after today?
Right here. You don't.
Oh.
I don't sell them online.
Oh, wow, okay.
And I'm actually finishing up my whole tour of the Southeast this month. In May, I'm off to
Where do you live?
Minnesota, Massachusetts.
Wow,
But I travel a lot.
sounds that way.
But you said you do take cards, right?
Yep, cards are fine, checks are fine. I do pay. I do all kinds of things. We always make it work.
You ever have that Massachusetts accent?
Well, I think that I just speak the King's English. What you're thinking of is a kind of a Boston accent.
Yeah.
And
They tend to do 20.
in the western half of the state, you don't hear that.
Oh, okay, okay.
So we good?
Yep.
Are they much against the Second Amendment where you are?
Well, the state certainly is.
Yeah, the state, if you take a gun into the state, do you?
Massachusetts it's not the worst. The worst is probably either New Jersey or Maryland.
America.
Are really anti-gun states. I've seen stories where people have spent time in prison because they accidentally drove over the state line with a perfectly legal gun in like Pennsylvania, and they took a wrong turn, ended up in New Jersey, and they're just they're in an orange jumpsuit for the next 2 years. It's just crazy how they enforce this stuff. And it's what is being served by that? How is anything positive being served by locking up this poor guy who didn't do anything wrong except he just drove out the wrong exit and with his perfectly legal gun where he came from? But they do that. So yeah, but Massachusetts is also not very gun friendly. On the other hand, northern New England is. Vermont, which is a seriously left-wing state. Vermont, I think gave Obama its highest percentage in the country. Vermont is very Democrat, but it also is constitutional carry. They don't even have licenses. You live in Vermont, you can take a gun anywhere you want. So it's interesting how these things work.
We want to thank Loren very much for coming to see Loren Spivack. And certainly we'll hang out afterwards. And will you autograph books for us?
I sure will.
All right, very cool. All right, well, thank you very much for coming and speaking to us. We enjoyed it. I'm gonna have Paul do our benediction so we can get started with some books then.
Lord, thank you for the privilege that we've had to listen to our speaker, and also we thank you for the enduring and durable planet that we live on. We know that you created it, and it does what you want it to do. So we appreciate all the resources. Please make us good stewards of those. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.